it appears that my clone is adapting to the controller pretty well.
Yeah. I would like to run a few more tests, though. It's not every Halloween I get to clone one of my own patients.
Well, I can't help but thank you to the moon and back once again. Who knew world-famous psychiatrist Dr. Albert Light also had a degree in genetics?
If I say it once, I say it again. Degrees are worth every penny. So, why are we doing this again?
Well, it's been a struggle to put out high-quality content in a short time. I mean, the last review took me almost 2 months to finish, and, well, now, here's Halloween.
Right, but you need my help by cloning you?
Yep, if there's a clone, he can play video games and capture all the gameplay footage for my next review while I do chores upstairs. It's genius.
If you say so. I'm just a little concerned about side effects. Cloning a human being to sit down on a couch and play violent video games all day, it seems a little cookie.
Side effects, schmide effects, he's perfectly fine. Look, he's playing through today's game perfectly. Itchy, tasty. Arcade 1-up machines are bringing the arcades back, but not in the way that one would think. There used to be such a big push to bring arcade games home via console ports. But these days, gamers are seeing a resurgence in the arcades getting physical ports in the form of more space-friendly smaller cabinets. Some gamers take this sort of thing to obsessive levels.
I can quit whenever I want to. I just don't want to.
Yeah, okay. While many gamers are gunning for these newfangled arcade 1-up machines, I've always had a different philosophy. See, there's video games that were released exclusive to the arcade market that were never ported to home console. Games that are in danger of being left in the arcades forever. I'm looking right at you, Cadillacs and Dinosaurs and Metamorphic Force. And what about other Data East classics like RoboCop? There's plenty of stuff that Arcade 1-Up should focus their efforts on in this writer's opinion, to rescue these types of titles from being left to fade away because of things like lack of interest on the developer's part or licensing issues. Thankfully, the good people at Flying Tiger Games have been bringing lots of Data East arcade cabinets to consoles via the Johnny Turbo's arcade lineup. The history is a bit of a long story, but to dive deeper into Night Slashers, it might help to get some history on how this game came to exist in its current ported form. Johnny Turbo was the nickname of a man named John Brandstetter, who controlled brand management for the TurboGrafx and the Turbo Duo in the early 90s. His relationship with Hudson wasn't limited to just branding though, as he formed a development and publishing company called Flying Tiger Games. In fact, several years prior to Konami's buyout of Hudson Soft, they moved their offices in with Flying Tigers, as they shared an office for several years prior to Konami's purchase of Hudson Soft and their properties. So, what does this have to do with the game we're talking about today? Night Slashers was an arcade-exclusive, horror-themed beat-em-up released in 1993 by Data East. Despite the North American release being censored, the Japanese version featured excessive gore, blood, and guts aplenty. However, with these kind of games under the early 1990s US government chopping block, Data East likely made the call to slightly censor the game to avoid hysterics over it on the western side of the world. Much like the previously mentioned Konami-released Metamorphic Force, both games were original properties that remained stuck in the arcades for decades. Thankfully, Night Slashers got lucky because Data East properties were mostly sold to mobile-focused game developer Gmode. The company began releasing the classic Data East back catalog through digital releases and even physical collections, like the Data East Arcade Collection on the Nintendo Wii. Gmode would continue to work with other publishers and developers to get Data East franchises back into the hands of gamers in as many ways as possible, and with a company like Flying Tiger Entertainment, They brought back the semi-familiar face of the brand manager that TurboGrafx fans had come to love, via the Johnny Turbo's Arcade moniker. Now that I am able to buy it for under $10 on either Nintendo Switch or Steam instead of hunting an original cabinet down, I was sold. Pop that bad boy on the big screen and you've got a fairly comparable experience in my opinion to the arcade. So now that we're past the little history lesson, let's see if Night Slashers is worth screaming over in all the right ways. First off, regarding the port, this version of the game has several different visual aesthetic options, including giving the visuals a more retro arcade style, so I personally went with that. There's plenty of things to do from this submenu, such as saving your progress, changing the aspect ratio, checking out the controls, and examining the screen style effects like scan lines, etc, etc.
Let's not forget, winners don't do drugs!
Oh, I'm not huffing paint. I'm stirring it. I'm stirring for research purposes. For science. Secrets.
Before the game begins, we're shown a nighttime shot as the camera pans down. Words stretch across the screen to tell the player that it's been 3 years since the world became overrun with monsters, the undead, and more. In this dystopia, cities are devastated, and the human populace is dying down. It's up to 3 heroes to save the world from the devastation that is spread throughout the planet. Jake, an American who had his arms replaced with cybernetic powerhouses. Christopher, a European martial artist and vampire hunter who gets his fashion from, King of Fighters and Art of Fighting's character named King. And finally, Hong Hua, the best martial artist throughout Asia. These 3 blast their way through 7 stages of guts and glory. The character designs are unique enough to be interesting, but frozen in time thanks to the outlandish outfits and hair.
Weird. I have the exact same coat that Jake has.
The game has up to 3 players, and while the majority of this review will focus on single player, we'll tackle the multiplayer in a bit, as it's definitely worth discussing the changes it makes in the gameplay. After putting in a few virtual coins and selecting your desired hero or heroine, the game decides to start off in the best way possible, crashing a frickin' van through a horde of zombies. This is always the best way to start any game. Though if you're going to have the game start like this, there's really only one song you can listen to while doing it.
What? Just because I'm old doesn't mean I don't know what good music is when I hear it?
Level design is pretty standard for a beat-em-up of this era. You move the characters around the entire physical area of each level, similar to Final Fight or Streets of Rage. You'll spend the majority of your time beating up enemies with various moves and advancing when the little arrow tells you to go. Sure, it's repetitive, but you know what you're getting yourself into when you play these types of games. Beat-em-ups are just carefree, mindless fun. The environments visited fit the nature of this dystopic world, with abandoned and condemned hospitals, creepy mist-ridden forests, creaking castles, ancient ruins where your characters attempt to seal off the enemy portals, the inside, then outside of a plane, then some sort of industrial-style levels where the final bosses reside. It would have been nice if they had added 1 or 2 levels fully fleshing out the evil that's taken over in the cities themselves, especially considering the game takes a maximum of an hour to finish. I realize it's designed for an arcade market though, so all of this makes sense. Controls are often the hardest thing to explain in a review, especially if they're not perfect. And while Night Slashers does a fair job in this category, I still have issues with certain elements. For one, I find that dashing by pressing left or right twice is too easy to do, creating some situations where I dashed when I didn't mean to. Your heroes have a lot of moves at their disposal, and I love the variety that both single and multiplayer brings to the table. Sure, there's the basic punch combo that leads into a really strong attack, the ability to switch from left and right to hit enemies behind you on the fly, and of course the jump attacks, but there's more than just that. Each character can hold down the attack button to produce a blue flame wheel around them. The wheel gets thicker and can eventually turn to orange, which is maximum level before your chosen character would get dizzy. And no, it's not from touching Fuzzy. I'm on to you, internet. Releasing the button during the thicker blue wheel, or the orange wheel, produces a specialized attack that doesn't use your health. Now, while there is a massive damage button that performs a flashy move, there's also an air variation on it if you jump and press the button. Each massive damage move, no matter the way that you do it, is colorful, fun, and wipes the screen of enemies in a unique way for each character. But it can only be used a limited amount of times with each life. Because of the amount of health it takes off, I generally only used this when there were too many enemies to handle. If you're low on health, it doubles as a block button since you can't do the special. This is a really genius move that I don't think I've ever seen any beat 'em up do since then, so kudos to the developers for this creative way of thinking. Plus, each character gets 3 types of throws depending on if you utilized a charge before throwing them, dash attacks, and even combo moves in multiplayer. Night Slashers has a lot going on for it with the various different moves in the game.
Probably my favorite of the bunch is when Jake grabs an enemy and does a forward slam by literally smashing the character by their feet into the ground like a baseball bat. So badass!
The power-ups that you pick up are a bit uninspired. There's a teeny tiny dagger, a sword, and some weird fireball thing I can never seem to hit anybody with. Then there's the food pickups, which get your characters exclaiming their enjoyment like it's Gauntlet or something.
Delicious!
In fact, Jake, Christopher, and Han Hua are pretty chatty throughout the game. There's some dialogue between enemies, but the words they speak out loud never match, and it's sometimes really tough to make out exactly what they say.
The night beings will rule!
Gonna be a baby. Gonna be a baby.
Gonna be a baby?
Gonna be a baby.
Gonna be a bagel?
Gonna be a baby.
Gonna be a banger?
I'm also quite partial to the multiplayer specialty moves, where 2 characters touching each side of an enemy can trigger a super move that destroys the enemy. Though I will admit, a lot of the moves in the multiplayer were figured out by mashing buttons. One thing I couldn't find was a recovery move for any character but Han Hua. If you mash, I think it's forward and attack, it'll send her flying into the enemy. I tried multiple times to repeat the same button press for everyone else the same way, thinking the moves were universal, but sadly I couldn't trigger anything. But regardless, I was still impressed by the amount of options you have in this game. There's a few fun tongue-in-cheek moments where the game tries to inject some dark humor into the mix with some minigame interludes between levels. They don't really do much for the player, but it sure is fun kicking the heads of zombies in the sand and bowling for zombies. The background has a bunch of fake products it's also advertising, which gave me a really nice chuckle. I know I mentioned RoboCop earlier, and the ads feel very similar to the commercials between news breaks, a nice touch to get the game more personality than it already had.
Buy that for $1.
Probably my most vocal complaint about this game is the lack of connection with enemies. In games like Final Fight and Streets of Rage, you really feel like your hits are connecting with the enemy, and a lot of this has to do with stellar sound design and the feeling of locking on when enemies are grabbed or attacked. But with Night Slashers, attacking enemies doesn't feel or sound nearly as tight. It just comes across as a bit floaty, even if the controls don't necessarily mirror this notion. Sound is a powerful tool in video games, and all the greatest beat-em-ups made you feel every punch, kick, scrape, jump, and super move. Night Slashers fails to do this, but it's not necessarily just a deal breaker. The game is still a blast, it's just not as bone-crunching, and for a horror-themed game, this is kind of important in my opinion. Single player feels a lot less frantic. There are still plenty of enemies filling up the screen to justify the naturally rising difficulty. The game doesn't have any issues with abnormal difficulty curvature as levels progress. I'd even say it's a little on the easy side. While I had more fun with friends in the same room playing with me, we frequently got lost in the amount of enemies we had to clear. It's an impressive amount of larger sprites, and there was virtually no slowdown too, which really blew me away. Night Slashers makes great use of colors, and while the gory animations of guts falling out is visually grotesque, there's some pretty wild style clashes here that show how much this game was trapped in the late 80s, early 90s aesthetic. The enemies are no different. Sure, you've got your standard zombies, but then there's the Jason clone, or is that Rick from Splatterhouse? Heck, even Teen Wolf gets in the mix. I found this to be creative and fun to look at, with plenty of character additions mixing the horror tropes up a bit. Heck, the game even takes after Castlevania with Frankenstein's monster, a Dracula imposter, a mummy, and even Death himself, all as bosses or sub-bosses. While the game looks good, whoever paced the dialogue should be fired or eaten alive, I don't know, but scenes go by way too quickly so you can't read them in full, probably to hide the ridiculous English and grammatical mistakes littered throughout this entire game. Like, what? Fortunately, the soundtrack more than makes up for the dialogue shortcomings. I already mentioned that the sound design regarding the sound effects was a bit hit or miss, but the music in this game is great all around. Most tracks invoke a spooky spirit, with haunting crunchy bass and wailing guitar. It's primarily hard rock based, but it does have lots of other musical genres such as hip-hop, industrial, dance, and it takes a lot of influence from 80s slasher flick soundtracks. There's some really cool guitar samples that get overlaid at parts that make it have a live flair to it. Here's a few of my favorite tracks. I had a blast playing Night Slashers, both with and without my friends. Despite its short length, bad text pacing, lackluster pickups, and weak attack sound effects, it had an absolutely stellar soundtrack, mostly smooth controls, and a frame rate which did not drop. With fun attacks full of variety and exciting graphics, it's totally worth picking up. Sure, it's corny, but if you're looking for something spooky fun to play alone or with friends, you can't go wrong with Night Slashers.
Well, Doc, we did it. We created a perfect clone of me so that way I can get back to doing what I love. Helping my wife with the dishes. I mean playing video games, of course.
Yeah, well, about that. Maybe you want to have a good look at your clone. I told you there would be side effects.
Well, back to the drawing board for next year. Happy Halloween! Now where's my gun?
Huge thank you to all patrons, but especially the Morningstar tier, WHIP tier, and higher. They are Super Jess, Trevin Adams, the Autistic Gamer 89, Derek Demitter, and Nintendo. If you're interested in signing up for the patron, just $1 down gets you a ton of awesome information, but there's other tiers that are available as well, where you can help donate to the channel and fund future reviews. Go to the links down below to do so. Want more Dude You Haven't Played This Game? Look no further. There's reviews that you can watch that I've selected that I think you'll like if you enjoyed this one, and they're right there on the page. Go ahead and click on the links and follow the videos. Otherwise, check out the playlist for something else you might like. As always, thanks for watching.